I'm Dr. Alina Polyakova. I'm president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, just here in Brussels from Washington. And it is such a pleasure, and I'm so thrilled to have the opportunity to welcome all of you to our inaugural 2025 Tech and Security Conference here in Brussels, where we opened our office last year, as well as in London. I'm particularly delighted that we get to host this year because CEPA has turned 20 this year, so we're celebrating a milestone for the institution as well. But why tech and security? You know, for us, tech and security have obviously become inexplicably linked and intertwined, not just over the last few years, but over the last several decades. But I think that hasn't quite come to the forefront until now because of Russia's invasion of Ukraine and all of the lessons that we are learning, not just about battlefield dynamics, not just about our collective defense and security and the vulnerabilities we have there, but also about the opportunities that we have in technology and the use of emerging tech, not just in our military capabilities, but more broadly for prospering from the opportunities presented by AI to figuring out how Europe and the United States can work more closely together to compete with China. And I would just say that in this race to win, or at least compete for technology on the global stage, Europe and the United States truly need each other. And we have so much to play for together, from ensuring that we have the military edge on the battlefield to, again, understanding how competitiveness can be anchored in the opportunities presented by technology, in particular AI. And as I was reflecting over the last 20 years, you know, where the alliance was in 2005 versus 2025, I was really struck by how much things change and yet how much they stay the same. And back in 2005, some of you may remember who are old enough in this room, the main concern on policymakers' minds was the global fight on terror. You know, and at that time, the transatlantic relationship was going through its own upheavals and tensions. I was reminded by a friend who's in this room but will remain unnamed for the moment, that when you were an American traveling to Europe at the peak of the Iraq War, you weren't that welcome in some places, to say the least. And I think it just signals to me that this alliance is too strong, despite the sometimes dramatic tensions that we have had between both partners. But we have always stuck it out together, and we have come out better on the other side. And I think this is another moment like that for us, where there's certainly underlying tensions. But at the end of the day, we will find a new equilibrium and a new baseline that will make us stronger and better positioned. And I think for CEPA, our institution has been very much ahead of the curve. You know, again, reflecting 20 years ago, what was CEPA doing then? We were really raising the alarm bells about Russia's imminent threat to European security and the broader global order. That was a laughable thing to say 20 years ago and has now looked quite prescient. And now, over the last several years, we have really invested in focusing on technology. And we did this long before ChatGPT broke out and made AI, you know, a commonly used tool in everyone's pocket. And for all of these reasons, I'm so delighted again to have the opportunity to have a conversation today that I think will present some new interesting ideas, bring in some new interesting voices into the conversation here, and will be one of many, I think, in the years ahead. But of course, we don't do everything alone. We do almost nothing alone, in fact, as an institution. We do everything with our partners and allies. Particularly grateful today to Amazon and to Google for working with us, making all of this possible, and being such partners to us over the years. And without further ado, I want to get us started, because it's a real pleasure to have over from the Atlantic here with us today, Karan, Bhatia, who is the global head of government affairs and public policy at Google, and also, most importantly to me, a member of CEPA's advisory group, the International Leadership Council. Karan, we have to come over to Brussels to actually see each other, but welcome. Please join me and take a seat on the stage. So Karan, great to see you.
You too, Alina.
I know this is not your first stop in Europe. You have been making a bit of a tour. And you and I were just chatting about some of the elephants in the room, so to say, that I think we are encountering on our trips to Europe as those coming from the United States. So, let's get to it.
Put an elephant out there, right?
So I think the big elephant in the room, honestly, tends to be trust now, right? I was alluding in my comments to the upheavals we have in the transatlantic relationship, and that this is one of those moments. And coming to Europe quite regularly from the US, I think we often hear a common question, and that question is the United States a reliable partner? And not just the United States government, but US companies.
Yep.
And Google is obviously a prominent US company. And so my first question to you is Google a reliable service provider in Europe?
I can give you a one-word answer, yes. How's that?
I thought you might say that, but tell us more.
But let me first of all, let me start by saying it's great to be here in Brussels with CEPA. You are leading a terrific organization, Alina, and your leadership and the growing presence here in Brussels to complement what you do in DC is fantastic. So thrilled to be here. Look, you're right. I mean, having just spent a few days touring different member state capitals, trust is a recurring theme of what we hear. And I think your comments at the beginning are spot on, which is that, this is a relationship that I've been involved in and watching, participating in for 25 years, and it has highs and it has lows, and we're certainly going through a challenging period right now. But look, the reality is, I think trust is not something. It is earned and needs to be demonstrated every day. And frankly, we've felt, I think, the need to demonstrate that we are a trustworthy company in Europe since our inception, since our founding. We've been in Europe pretty much since our founding. We were about a 27-year-old company. I think we've been in Europe for 25 of those 27 years with physical presence here. But I think it starts with, how do you show up in Europe? And what we have done is invested in a bunch of different ways in Europe that I think hopefully demonstrate our commitment and our trust to the continent. Investments including billions of dollars into the physical infrastructure that enables the internet to operate in Europe, data centers, subsea cables. There's just been, repeated votes of confidence that we've made through our dollars here. Partnerships, it is growing partnerships with big, trusted European companies. So today we go to market, certainly on our commercial side of our business, in partnership with great European companies like TIM in Italy, like T-Systems, and now the Schwarz Group in Germany. So we are constantly looking for ways to sort of grow our connectivity into the European ecosystem. And that continues with the work that we do with entrepreneurs. It's the work that we're doing with small businesses every day, startups. We are thrilled to have invested in more than today, what are 500 startups that are viable, growing businesses, hiring people, and sometimes becoming, they're people who've started in Google and migrated out, companies like Mistral, for instance, in France. And then the last thing that I would flag is training and skilling and the work that we need to do every day and love doing every day, helping raise the understanding and the skill level of average Europeans through the programs that we operate. And particularly now in this moment of artificial intelligence, where I think everybody is a little concerned about, what does this mean for my job? What does this mean for our economy? Investing in European programs that skill people for that economy, I think, is absolutely critical. And then the last thing I will just say is, notwithstanding all of this, which hopefully builds trust. And by the way, I don't mean to suggest Google's the only company. I mean, there are many companies, many sectors, I suspect, in this room will have similar stories. But I do think that there are things that one needs to do to address the particular challenge of the moment. And we, for a while, had heard concerns about digital sovereignty in Europe, about the need for companies and in particular governments to feel like they can control their data if it is placed with a US hyperscaler. Mm-hmm. And to that end, our view is, yes, we agree with you. And we agree that you should be able to exercise that right if you want to. And so we offer all of our customers here a level of control over their data that we think is industry leading. It involves everything from the ability to locate physical data here physically on our servers in Europe, to having encryption keys over the data that means it cannot be disclosed without the company wanting to do so. So we think that's a critical piece of digital sovereignty. So too, by the way, is security. You need to make sure that your sovereignty doesn't mean a lot if there's not best-in-class security. And then the last thing that I'll just flag is choice. We think giving customers the ability to move their data, to transport their data from company to company if they want to, is absolutely critical as well. So we've signed up to all of those commitments.
So thanks for outlining all that, Karan. I think you put a lot on the table. Just to pick up on a couple of things you mentioned, what really jumped out at me is, when we're talking about this question of trust and reliability between Europe and the United States and between American companies and European companies, partnerships are the key there. And I think we have and could have a similar conversation when it comes to the defense sector too. Yep. That's also where we can build greater trust. The more integration we have in industry, the better prepared and the more resilient we will be as an alliance to ensure that we have mutually cooperative relationships and that we are both investing from both sides. And I think people often underestimate, in all these conversations about Europe needing to do more, to invest more, to jumpstart its competitiveness, to jumpstart its innovative edge. But people forget how many Europeans have actually contributed to some of the foundational developments, inventions that have driven so much of the growth of the global tech sector and also the American tech sector. And I think we would be very wise to remember that. You also mentioned ecosystems and how investment in a sector actually ends up creating whole ecosystems of companies from small to medium to large. And I think these are the kinds of things we should be talking about, thinking about, how can Europe continue to attract investment from the United States and hopefully a lot more from the United States to ensure that it has a thriving and dynamic economy. So on that, AI is the obvious thing that everybody wants to talk about, and you also mentioned it. But I find that we've moved on into a more thoughtful conversation on AI in our last couple of years, and you started to get into that a little bit. So just to follow up on that, AI is everywhere, right? Yep. We were just chatting about how we personally use or don't use AI because I'm kind of a late adopter to things, but it should not be in our day-to-day. And Google certainly is at the forefront of the AI race that's happening in the sector, that's happening globally. And it also seems like it's in all the Google products now too, right? From search that all of us use on a daily basis. But I think on a strategic level, can you talk a little bit more, the thought you started to put on the table as to where you really see specifically how AI can strengthen European competitiveness and security? Because these are the big issues on the table now.
Yeah. And we'll answer that, but just to touch on something you mentioned in the lead-in, the fact that those partnerships often involve in Europe often involve the innovation of products jointly. Yeah. I think we see. I won't speak for other sectors, but I'm pretty confident it's true for defense and other sectors as well. But certainly in the technology sector, I would venture to say that there's no big company, and Google certainly is an example of this, that is not literally daily, hourly co-inventing products. We have people in Munich who are doing all of our security-related work for our products globally. We have a safety center in Dublin literally it's seamless. So that is exactly right. Look, I think the moment we are in technologically is the most consequential moment that I've seen that and am likely to see in our lifetimes right now. I mean, AI. It's not just the depth and substance of what it's doing, but it's the speed at which this is happening and that it is being incorporated into products. And we have we're in a privileged position to sort of see it across industries, and I'm seeing it across countries. Where, in Europe, it is being adopted by large companies, by large clients to absolutely revolutionize their processes. The efficient, we've working with Bosch, for instance, 12% reduction in energy usage just by adoption of Google Cloud AI tools. The work we're doing with major airlines here that's reducing both, again, energy usage, but also allowing them to deliver better, faster services to customers. So it's sector after sector, we're seeing this happening. And the science areas, and the work that it's going to enable for Europe to be at the forefront on science, on drug discovery, is extraordinary. So we're seeing a lot happening in that space. Now, I will one further point. When you think about Europe's challenges over the course of the last X number of years, and I think Mario Draghi put his finger right on this, if not the biggest, certainly one of the biggest challenges has been the productivity challenge, right? And that is the product of multiple things. It's demographics. You can talk about regulation and so forth. But AI is like manna from heaven if you have a productivity challenge. And we're seeing it be thought of and seen and addressed in that regard. So I think our thought about AI is going to be beneficial, we think, and create incredible opportunities for people everywhere around the world. But I would offer there may be no region where if you see real adoption of AI, deep adoption of AI, it's going to have a more profound beneficial impact than Europe. So you would say to yourself, boy, given that, what are we seeing? I mean, hopefully we are seeing Europe at the forefront of adoption. And there, the story, frankly, is a little more mixed. There has been good adoption of artificial intelligence by the biggest companies in Europe.
Right.
But in two spaces, you're seeing much weaker adoption. You're not seeing it by the small, medium-sized enterprises that constitute such a big chunk of the European economy. And you are not seeing it by governments themselves. And there's a lot of discussion as to why you're not seeing the SMB adoption. And I think it may, in fact, be traced to the fact that you're not seeing it by governments as much as well. But when you look at the numbers, for instance, China, I'll give you China, 50 to 80% of Chinese companies are incorporating generative AI products into their daily work streams. The number in Europe for all companies is 13%.
Wow.
And the numbers get substantially smaller when you're talking about small and medium-sized enterprises. If you want to look at total spend on AI-related products, in Europe, it's somewhere between 40, depending on the market, 40 and 75% lower in Europe than it is in the United States. So Europe, from my vantage point, this is the existential challenge that Europe needs to confront over the course of the next couple of years.
Absolutely. Those are some stark numbers that you just put out there. I mean, this graphics galore, if you do a quick search, to see the imbalance in the investment certainly between Europe and the United States. There's a little less information on China, but I think you would see the numbers you mentioned repeated all kinds of ways across the board. I think you're right, this is the big challenge. And I think often companies look for signals from governments, whether they should start implementing, integrating new technologies, and they're not getting those signals, then we're going to see a lag. Of course, as an institution that wants to see Europe and the United States on a balanced footing, I think the concern that I have had and many of us have had at CEPA has been this notion that, in 5 years, if we keep going on this path where Europe doesn't do what it needs to do, hopefully Europe will, the United States keeps running forward at rapid pace, as we do, with huge investments, then in 5 years, that gap is going to be too big.
Yeah.
And we don't want to see that. I don't think anybody here wants to see that. So I think the question is always, how do we jumpstart that investment? And so one of the answers to that, I think, also lies in the regulatory space, which you alluded to. So let me just ask you that as kind of my last question, because, obviously Europe has emerged and has been the global regulator when it comes to all kinds of things, but
Yep.
technology being the prominent one. And the AI Act has been under debate. Obviously, it is law, but I think we've been hearing some conversations recently about whether that legislation is actually going to serve the European interest of jumpstarting competitiveness and innovation. So what's your take on the current efforts to try to simplify, as the European term goes, or maybe even deregulate some of the AI particular legislation that we've seen come about?
Well, first of all, let me say I completely agree that the path forward for Europe to catch up and get ahead starts with governments. I very much agree with that. I think, and as we said, as as I mentioned, and you alluded to, I think it starts with governments adopting the technology in their own day-to-day activities, and leaving aside the signal that sends of confidence and trust that sends to the rest of the economy, which I think is very powerful. Well, it makes sense for governments themselves, right? We did a study, I don't know whether it was our study or somebody else's, but 100 billion euros a year could be saved by governments just by incorporating AI into their processes. Better services, lower cost, faster production, more secure. So anyway, the first point I would say is governments need to drive this forward, and they need to be vocal about it, right? I would love every European member state government to have an active AI plan and a strategy, and to be pushing them. So point number one. To the point about regulation, yes, absolutely. Look, I mean, I'm not going to be making any great news by saying that the regulatory environment in Europe on technology has been one where we've seen more and more regulation come at the sector, and not just the big companies, not just the hyperscalers, many different levels of the industry. From our vantage point, at a very high level, I think there are a few things that need to be done. We need simplification, right? At a macro level, these regulations need to be able to be applied in a way where you're not looking product by product by product and having to tweak each one. Setting some general rules and allowing companies to figure out how do they meet those standards, I think, is got to be part of the approach. The second is scalability, right? It is, it's very appealing to sort of think about setting a set of rules for big companies and exempting out SMEs. But the reality of what that does is it just limits the ability of companies to scale, right? They'll get up to a certain point, and then it'll be, oh my goodness, if I grow by another employee or two, this whole new set of things. So that's number two. And then finally, number three is harmonization. I mean, we're seeing just this proliferation of regulations at both the member state level and at the EU level is really leading to sort of increasing tension and conflict and sometimes inconsistent signals. So I would say at a macro level, that's what I would urge done. I think the AI Act and how it gets evolved into this AI code is going to be super important. And we're spending a lot of time thinking about that. And then the last thing, and I'll end on this note, that I think the European, both governments, Commission, et cetera, need to do, and quite frankly, we in the private sector and the United States needs to do, and it comes back to the point you started with, which is really think about things through a partnership lens, right? There is probably only one country in the world, and it is not either in Europe nor the United States, that can do AI alone. And so if the United States and Europe are going to be at the forefront of artificial intelligence and what it offers and what it presents, it is going to have to take the best of both. And that is everything from model training, compute capabilities, people, application development, and it's going to need to work together.
Yeah. More interdependence, more integration, not less. I think that's the answer to independence from China for all of us. And I think here you're right, that's the note to end on, is that Europe needs the US and the US needs Europe. And that's just the reality we have to live in this marriage, right?
Exactly.
No matter how many fights we have in between.
Yeah.
Karan, thank you so much for your
Thank you.
time. I really appreciate you being here. I know you have a busy agenda, but thank you for this interesting conversation as
Great.
always. And everyone, please join me in thanking
Thank you.
Karan Bhatia of
Thanks so
Google. Thanks so
Great to
much.
see you.
I'll let you
Thank
run.
you.
Thank you. And with that, let me just invite Gina, I'm going to mispronounce your last name, our practice Smilek, who's the bureau chief of here in Brussels of the New York Times, to introduce our next panel on autonomous systems. Gina, please.
Thank you, Alina, and thank you, CEPA, for both having this conference and having me here for this interesting conversation. As you just heard, this is obviously an enormously consequential moment in sort of the history of defense, the history of the transatlantic relationship, and obviously also the history of technological development, which is what we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about what autonomous systems mean for the future of warfare, how both the United States and Europe can be investing in them, and how these partnerships might evolve in coming years. And I think it's a really interesting moment to have this conversation, and especially to have this conversation in Brussels as Europe really ramps up its procurement push, as we talk a lot about the future investments in these technologies, and talk a lot about interoperability and how they might work together. I am Gina Smilek, as Alina mentioned. I'm the Brussels bureau chief at the New York Times. I'm going to be your moderator, and I will invite the panel up. We have a great panel for you today. We've got General Daniel Petrescu, who was formerly the Chief of Defense for Romania's Armed Forces from 2019 to 2023, and is now a member of the International Leadership Council here at CEPA. We've got Robert Jekyll. Did I pronounce that correctly? Yes.
You got it.
Who is the chairman and CEO of Airbus US Defense and Space. So quiet time for you. And we've got Lieutenant General Piotr Boisus.
Pretty good.
I'm working on it. Who is the commanding general for Eurocorps. So a great group of people to have this conversation today. Just to get it started, and I'm going to ask all of you this question, but we'll get started here. Obviously, the Allied forces face a number of key challenges today when it comes to adapting and integrating autonomous systems, both in operational planning, but also in capability development. Where are we today when it comes to sort of tackling those challenges, both as an alliance, but also from a national perspective?
Yeah, thank you, Gina. I will answer your question, but let me start thanking CEPA for inviting me here. I'm truly honored to be part of this organization. I truly appreciate the way you focus on tech and security, and I'm happy to attend this conference. And I want to underline what you said, Alina, at the beginning. Europe truly needs the United States, and the United States truly needs Europe. So this is something we need to keep in mind throughout the conference. I was told I have 5 minutes for some opening remarks,
Please.
but I will start with your question, and I will put my former commander face. And the commander is never happy with the resources he gets and with the capabilities he has. So I would say we make a lot of steps, but we are going into the right direction, but we are not going at the necessary speed, which is requested right now from our forces and for our capabilities. I think it's good that we focus on technology, and technology drives the way the warfare evolves. But I would start also saying that war is also a human endeavor, and we should not forget what Clausewitz used to say some centuries ago, that in order to be successful in war, the triad, government, people, and armed forces needs to work perfectly. So when we think about how technology works, this is only part of the issue. The other part is how you make this triad, government, people, and armed forces to work together. And because during this conference we focus on lessons learned from Ukraine and what is important for NATO, I would say that there are some important strategic lessons we can take into account before the war starts, during the war, and before and during the war, which are important for us. what we have learned, so before the war starts, weakness encourages aggression. And no country can defend or deter alone. When the war starts, aggressor obviously has more capacity. He has the advantage of hardware. Normal he has, because otherwise he would not have attacked. You need to counter him with limited resources, and you cannot do it alone. Raw warfare, firepower remains very important. Drones cannot replace people because you need people in order to conquer a certain and dominate a certain territory. But we can very well have what I've read in some articles, our Oppenheimer moment in terms of drones and artificial intelligence, because really the way this evolve could drive the future of warfare. What's in it for NATO and EU? Important thing is that technology drives the evolution of the warfare. We need to build our organization, and I'm not sure that we are really fit for purpose here, to be able to decentralize more, to be able to fail, learn, and recover, and to have a reliable defense industry that we can count on, because you cannot have all the drones in stock before the war starts. You need to be able to adapt, to use the civilian drones, to use artificial intelligence, and so on. And what is important, a very reliable supply chain. And here I think there are challenges we need to overcome. So where we are making a lot of steps. We are moving, but we need to speed up the way we move, in my opinion.
Okay, interesting. And as a member of the supply chain.
That's right. The supply chain gets beat up a lot. So, well, first of all, I think you'll hear some similar comments from my perspective. First of all, thank you also for including Airbus in this panel. I often say that as a heritage European company, but doing business in the United States, in defense, in space, in helicopters, we are a bit of the embodiment of the transatlantic alliance, and the ligature that allows us to be successful is that trust that underpins the alliance. In terms of autonomy and the national perspective and the alliance perspective of where we are, I'd say it's a mixed bag. In terms of the positive, when you look at the evolution from the Biden administration into the Trump administration, the positive is that there is a recognition of the importance of autonomy, both from the small tactical standpoint and Project Replicator, all the way up to more exquisite solutions like collaborative combat aircraft, where you have manned-on-manned teaming, and even in domains like space, with space situational awareness and autonomy. And I see that also in Europe, a recognition that autonomy is going to be a key enabler. I also see as a positive the funding. In the U.S., there is a clear funding support for unmanned systems and autonomy. In fact, you will see that a lot of the retransitioning of funding that's taking place in the U.S. in the Pentagon's budget is going from manned platforms to unmanned, particularly with the Army as a bill player. We still have manned-funded programs like the 6th generation F-47 and other elements. But I see funding. Other positive is I see a lot of non-traditional disruptive players in this ecosystem, both in Europe. You mentioned Mistral. You could add Helsing to that discussion. In the U.S., you have Oterion, and I think we have the benefit of Oterion doing a Fireside. But Shield AI, Anduril, a lot of really interesting, innovative companies that are self-investing in autonomy, and I'm teaming with those companies. In fact, Shield AI and Airbus US are investing in taking our manned helicopter and turning it into an unmanned platform so we can do distributed logistics for the Marine Corps in contested environments. And so that ecosystem of non-traditionals, innovation, all really good. Now to the other part of the mixed bag, I think I would agree with you from a national perspective, still not fast enough in terms of operationalizing capabilities. And certainly what Ukraine has been able to do on a cost-effective basis and with a sense of urgency of iteratively fielding autonomous solutions, I think that is the model. And when you look at it from an alliance perspective, I still think there's more that we could be doing in terms of co-production, co-design. What you described from the Google discussion this morning in terms of co-development, I see that in the commercial dual use space and commercial aviation. In the defense space, you're talking about classified systems subject to export control, different varying cybersecurity requirements. I think we need to lay flat some of the regulatory blob to allow that type of innovation, transatlantic innovation, to take place. And I think there's more that can be done in that regard. So.
Lieutenant General.
All right, ready for a long lecture? Because this is the most the mistake you always make. If you give a microphone to the general, he's gonna speak for a long time. But anyway, what you're gonna hear from me is obviously are my personal opinions that are not necessarily official position of my Ministry of Defense, because I am, I'm a former vice chot in the Polish General Staff, but now currently serving as the commander of the Eurocorps. So first of all, I think there's no doubt that this unmanned autonomous systems, let's call them, it's a disruptive technology innovation. And this is something that we can probably compare to things like what Admiral Jackie Fisher was doing with introduction of the dreadnoughts, something that was happening when Air Force came online, when naval aviation came online, and also when aircraft carriers came online. All the resistance that those people were facing when they're trying to innovate and change, we're seeing some of it now a little bit with the drones, I think. But what's important is introduction of the systems changed the battlefield geometry, but didn't bring any decisive solution for the moment, okay? And it happened many times in the history when you look at any kinds of, let's call it the old name, Wunderwaffe, okay? They change some of the tactical issues. We were able to win some battles, but at the end, it didn't change the course of the war. Now, something to remember, there is no such thing as a NATO or EU army, okay? It's a misperception. In reality, it's a 32 armies, well, with maybe exception. There's one country that doesn't have the army really, 27 member states on the EU side. And those are the ones that that are deciding about the future. EU and NATO are just pointing in the direction. It's giving the target goals and so on. But in reality, as mentioned here and then before, this is all about the governments that have to make this decision and the militaries that have to implement it. On the NATO side, there is quite a lot written in the operational standardization about the air manned systems. There is very little on the sea. We're having some problems, I think. Sorry, no problem. Thank you. So there is very little on the side of the sea unmanned systems, on the ground ones, and almost nothing on the space ones, which is already happening, but this is something that we don't consider. But in reality, to me, all sorts of satellites are unmanned systems. Chinese, as you know, grabbed one of the satellites, the old ones, and they were able to move it to a completely different orbit. And by the way, it was not discovered by the military systems, but it was a private company that informed the military, hey, did you notice that Chinese have showed this capability? Now, I'm a strong believer that before deciding on the structures, organizational structures for introduction of such systems to any organization, first, we should quickly revise our doctrine and the operational concept. The operational concept in the military means how we want to fight. And only then we can really decide on the structures level and so on. I strongly believe, just like in Ukraine, like the US and a number of countries, the unmanned systems should go down to the company level. That's why the solution, the way I look at the employment, I should say, of those systems is on one hand, they should be simple ones and they should be integral part of the units, but also certain more complex systems should be a separate units, like Ukrainians have those FPV brigades, right? And then those higher level capabilities are just assigned to particular units to enhance their capabilities. In NATO, there is a NATO Task Force X run by ACT. This is a great development. This is more focused on the sea unmanned systems, but this is a good start. There is a discussion, there's showing the capabilities, what it can do, and with respect especially also to protection of the underwater infrastructure. There is a drone coalition on the NATO side, as you know, that countries are providing a lot of those unmanned systems to the Ukraine. Now, but in reality, to introduction of those systems, it's all about our adaptability, our ability to innovate, and also cutting the red tape, because all of our countries are facing. I'm trying to purchase some even miniature unmanned systems for the Eurocor right now. And trust me, I'm being told, sir, but you cannot use it here. You need the special licenses for the people to operate them. It takes time, money, and you cannot use it here because it's too close to the airfield, and so on and so on. And I'm telling my team, doesn't matter what system we buy, the idea is that we have the process done, that we have the procedures that if we have such systems, then we're able to easily incorporate them into my headquarters, usually the so-called Joint Operations Center or a Tactical Operations Center. So I strongly believe unmanned autonomous systems should in the future become the part of the military soldiers' DNA, and sailors obviously and airmen. It should be something similar in the future, like the use of the gas masks by the soldier or automatic weapons. The mentality should be there, but also ability to quickly use. And I'm talking about really complex systems, right? But simple ones, cheap ones that are changing this battlefield geometry. And just to finish up, what are the main, I would say, obstacles in making this change faster? Comfort zone, okay? In the military, a lot of us are in the comfort zone. We're used to doing things a certain way. We have certain experience from this counterinsurgency operations. Some of my friends are not willing to get out of this comfort zone, okay? And it's difficult. The other point is obviously it's changing the mindset and the culture. The whole discussion about manned versus unmanned, pairing, or maybe eventually unmanned taking over the manned, very complex discussion with my friends pilots, also with the sailors, telling them you don't need big ships anymore, that many. You need some, but focus more on those unmanned autonomous systems. The doctrinal, as I mentioned, and operational concept change. This is something that usually takes time. I think Ukraine took 3 years, from what I heard, to develop their own doctrine on how to use those systems. And again, right now we're seeing rather great use of the air unmanned systems. The recent attack in mermaids, very little on the ground, and obviously quite a lot on the Black Sea, which was quite successful. I've seen something to tease the Navy admirals, hey, so look at what's happening in the Black Sea, and they don't even have the Navy, right? And last point, it's also all about experimentation, simulation, proving and showing to high-ranking commanders the value added of this innovative technology, of this disruptive technology innovation. Because when they see the value added, when they see that they can lose a certain simulation because the enemy is using those systems, this is the best way to kind of make them think. Thank you.
I'm actually going to stick with you, so hold on to your microphone for the moment. To your point that it's not one NATO army, it's not one EU army, it's rather 32 militaries. I wonder, we've obviously seen both Ukraine and Russia really investing in and creating new branches in their military specifically for these unmanned systems. Is that something that these 32 militaries should be thinking about? Is that something that the rest of Europe should be considering?
You mean the structures?
Yeah.
As I said, they are important and we need them. And actually, they're slowly being introduced in different militaries. They, as usually in NATO, they will probably differ. Will not have the same structure for a number of reasons in different armed forces. In Poland, for example, we just created, it was stood up on the 1st January of this year, I would say, unmanned systems component command. So we are trying to get, everything together. It's a little bit like in the US that Replicator 2, that you have two, I think, what I understand, two major procurement branches of the armed forces that Army and the Air Force are buying slightly different systems. But the idea is to get it together, work on this doctrine, okay, introduce it even more into our operational concept. So it's happening in a number of countries. The recent UK white paper also stresses the importance of those unmanned systems. And we've seen the success of those systems. But the issue is, just like with the Replicator program in the US, one is about having those systems, the other one having systems that will defend us from the systems. And the third one, angle I would add, taking over the enemy systems. Ability that, if enemy is using certain systems, are we able to take over the systems and turn them against them? Thank you.
Oh, interesting. I want to come back to Replicator, but before I do, I wonder, General Petrescu, if you could tell us a little bit about how this all looks from where you sit.
Yeah, in terms of what you asked, having the different headquarters and the different force category and so on, I'm a little bit more old school regarding this. And I wonder why the Russians and the Ukrainians did that. And my personal opinion is that you need to integrate at the very low level, and they have units involved in the fight, so they needed somebody from the back to take care of the doctrine, to take care of the production, to take care of all the issues, .ml, PFI, the way we say in the armed forces, in order to have the system work. So there are advantages, but there are disadvantages. In my opinion, yes, we need to integrate in the Navy, we need to integrate in the Air Force, we need to integrate in the Army, and we need a headquarters to be able to push for more innovation, for building more drones and so on. So I wouldn't create a special combatant commander only for the drones. But we'll see how things evolve, and we need to adapt.
Yeah, interesting. And on one of the points that the Lieutenant General was making, I wonder if we could get your perspective on it. Obviously we have seen the success on the Black Sea for Ukraine, and I wonder how that informs how we integrate this it sort of on the sea in a Navy sense.
Yeah, definitely using unmanned system on the Black Sea. This is at the core of the Ukrainian success was in pushing the Russian Black Sea fleet, from Crimea farther west. But we should not focus only on drones, because there was a system of systems there. You need good intel regarding what is going on. You need good surveillance on the whole of the Black Sea. You need cooperation. You need cyber warfare. You need space, and so on. It's very interesting to me, and one of the lessons learned from using drones and artificial intelligence in Ukraine, it's how much the civilians get involved into supporting the armed forces in fighting the enemy, how this expands, and how much when the adversary is that powerful, you need to counter him not only with hardware, you need to counter with your intelligence and creativity and so on. At the core of the Ukrainian creativity is this pushing towards more unmanned system. And this has a psychological effect not only on the military, but also on the civilian society, because it brings success. And using more is like reinforcing success. So what we see in the Black Sea, it's a system, more things, but I agree, the unmanned system are at the core of that success.
That's a really interesting point, because is that something that can be replicated? Can you systematize that kind of all hands on deck?
I think if you want to have success, you definitely need to replicate that. Yeah. And yesterday evening during the reception, we had an interesting conversation, and it was an interesting idea. So think at the Ukrainian successes with spider web, spider net, whatever, and think if that attack would be on our ports, General Breedlove underlined last evening, how we would defend and how successful would be in defending against such an operation. Because what is happening right now could happen anytime in a future conflict. We, the military, have the tendency to prepare for the last conflict we've seen. We need to think about the future, but we need not to forget what is going on right now and how we prepare for this.
Yeah, interesting. Mr. Jekyll, I'd like to come to you. From an industry perspective, I wonder if you can talk. We've heard a lot from the national or global perspective about what sort of the big challenges are. But from your perspective, what are the big challenges to getting autonomous systems out there, to making them an integrated part of the military system?
Yeah, it's a good question. Just coming back to the question of where do you place responsibility for drone warfare? Is it the unit? Is it a special drone squad? This has impact on the industry side, interestingly enough, because in the U.S. there's clearly a push on the tactical drone side to have this at the unit level, right? And so when we are developing tactical drone capabilities now, put aside the exquisite solutions, we'll spend as much time with our engineers on how do these systems work in a GPS comms denied environment, one side. The other side is, what is the user interface of this equipment? It has to be user-friendly so that private first class can take this and within a day of training is actually able to deploy this. And that's a little bit different from what aerospace industry has been doing on exquisite solutions, right? Where you're assuming you have a specialist or a software engineer operating some of these capabilities. And so where you put it in the command structure is actually having cascading impacts on how we develop the technology and solutions. So your question was, the challenges of, from an industry standpoint, I would say the technology, and I find this is more and more frequently the case, the technology is usually not the problem. It is the policy incentives and the demand signals that you need to step to, right? So there's any number of capabilities that we could scale today. The question is there a reliable demand signal or a funding horizon for that, either with a long-term program or at least the concept that the government's going to engage in a spiral development ecosystem so you can invest on the one hand, and on the other hand, the legitimate policy concern about vendor lock, right? And in an area where there's such rapid iterative innovation, I think that's where policy and industry struggle a little bit, right? We want affordable mass, we want scalability, but we also want to be able to rapidly onboard innovations. And I think that at least a potential avenue is on the hardware side to try and have design freezes and long-term procurement, also have modular open systems architecture. So this is what we're doing on our military helicopters, right? We're taking a commercial off-the-shelf helicopter, but we're working with L3, Imperial Labs, and other companies to onboard a digital backbone that, you can buy the hardware. You can buy 500 of these helicopters. The Marine Corps can buy them, the Army can buy them, and you will have a MOSA system so that as there are new innovations on the C2 side, command and control, sensors, that you can implement those without being worried about vendor lock. But I think that is one of the challenges that we face. I want scale, I want capacity. I don't want to have another 155 scenario where I can't get enough rounds because I didn't have an inventory, but I also don't want a 10-year contract for stuff that's going to be outdated in 6 months. So those are some of the challenges. I've sort of teased out maybe a solution that could work in some contexts.
Yeah, interesting. I want to get back to the replicator program, and I'll stick with you for a second if you don't mind, because obviously we've seen this in the U.S. A, I wonder, do you think it's been successful? And B, do you see any opportunities on the horizon for Europe to do something similar?
Yeah, I think it's always safe to channel other industry voices rather than saying it yourself. I would say when Replicator was announced by Kat Hicks, the reaction, and I'm synthesizing, was this is a great idea. Where's the money? Because there wasn't really a separate funding associated with the program. And the sense was, hey, you've got all of these, there's a Navy program, there's an Air Force program, there's an Army program looking at tactical drones, autonomous solutions, both airborne, sea, subsea, but where's the additional funding? Are we just cannibalizing those existing projects and trying to bring them forward? I think as things have evolved, there's positive support from a funding perspective on autonomy. And so I think it will be successful. In terms of Europe, the whole idea of Replicator is creating a hellscape of unmanned systems, right, in various denied environments, probably Asia Pacific. So think about a seaborne drone, subsea, airborne, and it has to be mass and it has to be affordable, right? And that's the concept. And I think that Ukraine has demonstrated the value proposition, not just for Asia Pacific, but also for the European theater. What I do think, when you're talking about affordable mass, I do think that there should be a value proposition of working transatlantically on either the production capacity on the hardware side. So yes, I see a value proposition for Europe. And I also see a value proposition for working through the alliance. I mean, we're trying to do this with AUKUS, right? Pillar 2 of AUKUS, which is UK, Australia, United States, started with nuclear subs, Virginia-class subs, but now they're moving to hypersonics and AI and autonomy. I think that type of co-design, co-creation, co-production in AI and autonomy it's a useful concept to pursue transatlantically as well within key either Five Eyes or other key NATO allies. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, interesting. Please go ahead and react.
All right. As mentioned, the idea for Replicator is to have so-called attritable capability. So cheap and something that the commander is more willing to put at risk because it's easy to replace, not like MQ-9s that the US has lost to Houthis, right? Quite a few, very expensive, and it takes time to manufacture them. I think what I see the success of this program, because it's happening. The target goal for the Replicator 1 and 2 is more or less 18 to 24 months to achieve as much as possible, and it seems that it's really progressing. The success story, I think, is this cooperation between the DoD as the user, let's say, between the manufacturers as the ones that are manufacturing and the US Congress, which is responsible for all sorts of policies, but also especially for the funding. And funding is there now, I believe, of 50, 100 million or whatever the amount is, I don't remember. So this is something that it's worth looking at, that in Europe, if we want to make it happen, how to get this trio together to talk to each other and quickly adjust to whatever is really required. Now, a little bit for going back to the previous discussion. I think, and I'm not endorsing this product, but it's a good example of the Maven. Maven is a success in the Department of Defense, but it's also now being purchased by the NATO. It's a great integrator, open architecture, system that allows you to almost plug in any type of source of information you need. With AI, be able to scrutinize it, filter it, and deliver to what you are interested to. So this is already happening. It's all obviously the challenges with building the right databases and having access to the right databases. The other example, and again, I'm not endorsing of a great product, is the data miner. Something that no intelligence agency can beat the timing on the alerting and warning, not on telling you what it means that something happened in the world, but just giving you the alert, hey, look. And I can tell you that a lot of important people have direct access and they get those alerts, immediately that something is boiling in a certain part of the world that are of interest to them. So to sum up, the technology is there, and Replicator, from my perspective, is a good example of how you can structure this kind of initiative. And I think in Europe, we also should probably do something similar. There are a number of programs, right, under both organizations, but I think having it more even structured would probably bring even greater access. And the last point, I'm a big fan of the additive manufacturing, the 3D printing. This is going to change the battlefield dramatically. And I know that, for example, the US Multi-Domain Task Force is already experimenting with manufacturing those drones, in the garage, as we say, right? There are some challenges, but it's happening. The logistics, huge change for us. If we'll be able to manufacture the spare parts on the spot, more or less, huge change for the whole supply chain. Thank you.
If I could add some ideas here, I think there is definitely moment in Europe to invest more in defense. When I look at the initiatives, there are a lot of initiatives from Security Action from Europe, Readiness 2020, European Chips Act, Cyber Resilience Act, PESCO, and so on. But I'm not sure how much we are prepared to move forward and adapt the procedures, because we try to invest more in drones and work collaboratively, but using the same procedures in each country. And I think buying drones is not the same like buying 155. And our procedures somehow are adapted to buy 155 right now. 155 I can buy, put in storage, and use it when I need in 10 years and so on. Drones, if you are in war, yes, there is definitely an advantage. You buy and you use it. But if you are not at war, you cannot afford to buy that many and keep them in storage, because they will be obsolete in 1 year, in 2 years, and so on. So how can we find that balance in order to adapt our procurement procedures? That is a question. And I'm not sure we are doing enough here.
That's interesting. I wonder if you have hope for, obviously I sit here in Brussels all the time, and we talk endlessly about this $150 billion loan program that the EU is rolling out called SAFE. Do you have a lot of hope for that? Like, do you think that could offer the kind of flexibility for purchases that you're talking about, or?
Very honestly speaking, I think we have as many chances to succeed as we have to fail.
Optimistic. Okay, I'm just going to ask one more before we go to the room for questions. So get your questions ready. But all of you have touched on or talked directly about this idea that sort of transatlantic cooperation is a really important part of this development of autonomous systems and these technologies and the integration of these technologies. And obviously, you know, as we talked about on the first panel, the elephant in the room is sort of the tension around that transatlantic relationship. And so I wonder if each of you, and we'll just go down the line, but I wonder if each of you could take a turn, just sort of an overview of where you see that relationship sitting right now, and then how do you think that's going to sort of impact the future of procurement and technology integration into military systems?
In our national security strategy, we say we based our security on 3 pillars, and this is NATO, EU, and the special relationship with the US. So I think the special relationship with the US is essential, not only for the EU, but for every European country. And I hope we will find the wisdom in order to keep that, you know, going and to take advantage. I mean, use that for our own security, because we said at the beginning, US needs Europe, Europe needs the US. So I'm optimistic that will be wise. And I don't think we have to choose like a European country right now between US or EU. We need to push both to work together. I hope that will happen. This is my hope.
Yeah, I think that's well said. You know, when you look at our near peer adversaries, competitors, you could say from a manufacturing industrial standpoint, they're on a war footing. And the discriminating asymmetric advantages that I think that we have as allies are one, commercial innovation, particularly software and AI, potentially space superiority. And then the third is our series of alliances with fellow democracies. And all 3 of those, I think, need to be put on steroids. I tend to take a longer term, more optimistic view of the alliance. You know, I was working in Paris during the Freedom Fries era, and I remember studying the Suez crisis, between allies, where, we're not any Suez type crisis where some people are talking, France is withdrawing from the NATO command structure, which they did, and then they ultimately rejoined. I think these marriages, I still think is like a marriage, right? And marriages are going to have those sort of rocky points, but I'm overall optimistic because I don't see an alternative logically. No.
I concur with this comparison of the marriage. Sometimes there are quiet days, things happen, but at the end, in most cases, we get back. I would say that this is not the first time that we are on a rocky road bumpy road between the countries on both sides of the Atlantic, we are always able to overcome it. Even during the Cold War, there were some serious crises within the NATO caused by what US was expecting. US was telling Europe many times, you need to spend more on defense. We cannot always, provide for you for defense. You should be part of it too. So this is nothing new, I would say. This was, as I mentioned, there is this book by Robert Kagan of Power and something, I don't remember the title, from 2000, Paradise and Power. If you read it and you quote it today, it's still valid. I mean, this is surprising, but so I don't worry about these relations. It's all about always communications. As we discussed yesterday, it's all about explaining each side the narrative and being very open about certain issues and going forward. Because I think there are interests on both sides. Because, okay, hypothetically, if Europe is able to start manufacturing certain products that are not now available in Europe, then the US business will lose, right? Because Europe will not be buying US origin products anymore. So I think we need a balance. F-35 is the best example. Is there really a need for Europe to try to develop a similar, extremely expensive, very capable platform? Or maybe we should focus on something else? A lot of discussions are really associated with this one. But I would say in Poland, with regard to this issue, we always say that it's always good, instead of having one insurance security policy, having two, being both Europe and the US, and working together. It's also all about the secure supply chain and ability to move, forces, troops across the Atlantic. It's all about the dual-use technology. It's all about accessibility to this technology. Nowadays, it's not like in the old times that there was only one company that had certain technology. A lot of those technologies, especially, for example, AI, it's changing so fast and it's so available, to anybody that it's amazing. So it's difficult for the companies probably, but that's what's happening, right? Ukrainians are using certain products that are available, to anybody online. I always have this crazy idea that maybe in the future it will be more possible, again, going back to General Breedlove yesterday and his discussion about the proprietary rights, maybe we can develop certain products, i.e. with EU funds, then the EU is also the owner of this technology and can award or for a little money give those licenses to certain companies. Okay, why don't you manufacture it? Here's all the documents you need to start doing it, and then we'll provide a little funding. Because it's difficult, I understand, for the business side, because you're breaking certain, accessibility to funding and so on. But I think it's the future. With the development of the technology, AI is everywhere. And ChatGPT versus the Chinese version, right? It just showed up all of a sudden, right? And it's available to anybody. So I think that's the future. Industries, I think, will adjust. And the transatlantic relationship, I think, always survived all types of, thunderstorms or even tornadoes. And I think this is going to be the case this time too. Thank you.
It's either a marital dispute or a natural disaster, what you're telling us. Okay, we're going to take a couple of questions before we go to break. I think there's a microphone going around. Should we start back here? Yeah.
Bogdan, I'm from Ukraine, student currently at the University of Dundee, Scotland. Thank you for this presentation, for this talk. It was very insightful, and that's my first time in CEPA. That's amazing. Thank you. That's fun what you're doing here. Yeah, and my question was initially about not technology, but doctrines, tactics. But thank you, all of you. You answered that, because I think that not technology changing battlefield, but how you implement this technology. Speed of decision making, how you implement them. That's a key, in my opinion. And the question, So in Europe, it is a top-down innovation cycle. But what we see in Ukraine, it is bottom-up. So in all these innovations like drones and electronic warfare. That's because of bottom-up innovation cycle. What do you think about Europe? Does it possible in peaceful Europe right now to make these bottom-up innovations, taking, of course, Ukrainian experience, or Ukraine, that's a unique case? Thank you.
Do you want to start?
Yeah. When you say Europe, I guess you mean the European Union. Okay. Yes, probably there is a top-down tendency to regulate, but I don't think this top-down stops the bottom-up. And it's not only that, we should not look only into what the Brussels is doing, what the Brussels is asking us to do. Each country has its own responsibility to develop the capabilities within the armed forces, and the countries can use what is good coming from Brussels, and they also can encourage the bottom-up innovation in their own countries. So I don't see a conflict about top-down and bottom-up. What I see in Brussels, though, and is true, for example, if you look at the European Union programs for innovation, there is more like a push towards the civilian innovation, like, for example, dual-use technologies, in my opinion. It's more like we need civilian first, and then let's see if we can use them for military use. So probably this is some area where we can improve these dual-use technologies and force more to innovate for the military also. But otherwise, I don't see that conflict happening, and I love the EU.
Yeah, I mean, I don't have, I think that your reaction of the innovation taking place in the commercial space resonates with me, particularly in AI and software. And I see the pace there as frenetic. And I would say in the US particularly, in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And, you know, how do you innovate in the absence of a crisis in large governmental bureaucracies? There's so much ink spilled on that. I remember during the Gulf War, we were able to very quickly implement MRAPs, up armored vehicles, because we had bodies, right? And you can do it in a crisis, and Ukraine is in a crisis, and so they're rapidly innovating. How do you have that rapid innovation in a large defense procurement environment is something that, you know, we've been trying to do for years, and there are pockets where it works, like DARPA, DIU, DIUX in Austin, and I think there's these incubators. But to do it at scale is if you could figure that out in peacetime, to have that sense of urgency of innovation in large procurement organizations, then you will have solved, you know, the last 50 years. And that's why I think in terms of looking for innovation, we've got to use more commercial dual-use technology, you know, and that would sort of be my talking point to the government. The innovation is taking place. There is that sense of urgency because these startups are going to go out of business, right? And it's life or death. And so they're rapidly innovating. It's always been the policy of the US government to use commercial off the shelf, but I'd say it's been used by exception rather than by the norm. I think we need to flip it. Again, I can't speak. So I know your question was on Europe. I started speaking more broadly.
Again, I was already mentioned, the main difference is that Ukraine is at war. And it's all about the survivability of your country. So you were able to really cut the bureaucracy. And as you said, a lot is coming bottom up. At the beginning, the companies didn't even have to register. They were just manufacturing, you know, all sorts of drones and so on. In Europe, we're in peacetime. I mean, we're not even officially in crisis. So that's why it's much more complex for us. The other point I want to make is I'm a strong believer that the whatever architecture for any unmanned systems we build has to be an open one. So on one hand, it should be built by the consolidated, strong European companies, but at the same time, there should be ability for a small companies, startups, if they have an application, if they have a program that is very, very good, that we're able to plug it in. And in the US, you mentioned DIU, they did a phenomenal job of making it easier for small companies and startups to get access to the normal procurement system, which before was impossible. You mentioned Rumsfeld. Rumsfeld was the one that was really upset with the procurement procedure in the Pentagon. MRAP, one example. But he cut it down to, I think, to 9 months or so, the turnaround. The challenge for us is also, for example, we have certain jamming systems, and you know that Polish airspace is often violated by the Russian drones. The problem is you cannot really use those systems in peacetime. So you have to be careful, because if you turn them on, you cut out almost anything in this area. Also, doing big exercises using electronic warfare in Europe is very difficult, and you know why. So, last point about the jamming, I think what Ukrainians did a phenomenal job is they keep changing the frequencies, and they're also using fiber cables for the drones, and Russians are jetting. But what it cost to the Russian jamming systems, they had to invest even more money to now cover much wider spectrum of the frequencies that they have to cover. So you are doing, as Ukraine, a phenomenal job. You are really making it very costly for the Russians. And I think we all will continue supporting you as much as we can, because in Poland we know that if Ukraine, for whatever reason, there is a negative outcome, there are other countries that could be the next ones to be picked on. Thank you.
I think we have time for probably one more rapid question. No. We're thinking. One really quick question, and then we will wrap. I think we have one up here.
Thank you. Ramon Asenio's cabinet of Commissioner Kubilius. Very short question. Exactly at the very, very beginning of this event, you spoke about the partnerships between EU and US, and then we moved to the military domain. So do you see those partnerships evolving also in military domain with Ukrainian companies that would be ready also to be established on the EU soil? And if you see them, what challenges you meet exactly at those practical details?
Industry.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting question for Lorenz, who's going to be doing his fireside, and he'll tell you, I think, some interesting things that they're doing. Look, I believe it's inevitable that there will be collaboration, teaming, joint venturing, co-investment, industrialization at some point with the Ukrainian industry that has proven itself in the context of this conflict. In terms of the status of that and pacing, I don't have individual personal insight, but I would be surprised if it were otherwise, that global defense industries, everything from small companies to large traditional primes, it would be foolish to not look at those capabilities that have been developed and see if they can help scale them or co-produce. I just think that would be logical. Right now it's in the middle of the fight, and so perhaps it's not sufficiently mature. But I would be surprised if it were otherwise long term.
Just a small add-on. I think everybody is collecting as many lessons learned, lessons identified, and try to turn them into lessons learned from what Ukraine is doing. And they are extremely innovative. The Neptune missile is another example, right? So they, I think, advanced in a number of areas where maybe we are now doing more R&D or thinking about it. So absolutely, it's a warfare, and I think it's quietly happening. I will not speak on the behalf of the German companies, but I know they are the ones that are having some success in this cooperation. There is a discussion about setting up the factory in Ukraine and so on. The challenge obviously is the risk acceptance by the companies, right? Because it becomes a legitimate target for the Russians, and then you kind of have to accept it that potentially this factory could be destroyed. But I absolutely believe that this is one of Ukraine right now is the best battlefield lab. Whatever you develop in the defense industry, tech, this is the best area to test. And in a way, the cheapest one. You don't need to create, artificial environment to test it. And I think that's what's happening too, that certain systems, certain solutions, certain applications are being used and tested. And we should continue it. But again, as mentioned by my friend here, I cannot imagine that we will not take advantage of the Ukrainian experience in how they were able to first cut the bureaucracy, again, different circumstances, as I mentioned, how they were able to encourage this innovation, and how generally they've been able to a large extent, change from the Soviet-style thinking to a very modern one that exceeds even in some areas us. Although, very honestly, there are some areas that, some commanders that are also thinking a little bit the old way. But in general, I must say, this is a good example of if we want to prepare for the threat that both NATO and EU recognize, meaning Russia, we need to really look closely and take what we think will be useful for us. Thank you.
Okay. And very, very quickly, did you have any thoughts?
I'm not an expert into this field, but I think what you mean, so I don't see why not to happen the partnership. I think the issue is how you get this partnership with the Ukrainian companies to get access to the EU funding and the EU programs and so on, like third-party participation into the EU programs. And I know there have been discussions when the US had to be involved in EU programs. So I'm not an expert into that, but this is something we need to consider.
All right.
Very quick one. Two other issues that I think a lot of countries and industries are concerned also in this cooperation. One is the infamous proprietary rights and transfer of technology. And the other one is something that Ukraine is really improving, is the issue, obviously, of corruption. I mean, they went a long road, and they keep improving. But this is still, for some organizations, a factor. Thank you.
And I think with that, we need to leave it. There is going to be a break for refreshments now, and the program will restart after that. So thank you all.
Thank you.
We're going to continue on with our conversations, focusing on autonomy and defense tech and the defense sector more broadly. It is my absolute pleasure to continue the conversation from the earlier panel this morning with the co-founder and CEO of Aterian, Lawrence Meyer, who lives on a plane, so he's come, I think, a long way to be here today. So Lawrence, thank you so much for being here. Let me welcome you to the stage.
Thank you.
So, in the spirit of not having long introductions, but getting right to the interesting conversation, first of all, I'm going to ask you about Aterian and what you guys are up to in Ukraine, because you have been at the cutting edge of deploying some of the new capabilities that are being used in theater on a daily basis now. But before we get there, I want to talk to you about Spiderweb, because the operation that Ukraine carried out just over the last weekend was not only innovative but sophisticated and used sort of the system of systems approach that General Petrescu talked about, combining traditional intelligence, new capabilities. Incredible operation that I think has been a complete game changer. You wrote about this very briefly, and I wanted to get you to talk about it because you said that the key takeaway from the operation is that the means employed are not just commercially available. Most of it is free on the internet, in fact. And as a result of this, we're entering a new era of warfare, where easily accessible technologies produce strategic outcomes. Those are your words, I think, on X. What did you mean by that?
I think what we've seen in Ukraine is initially innovation on the direct front line, right? Where on the brigade level, now suddenly you had a lower cost weapon to destroy tanks, like the anti-tank guided missile got replaced by an FPV drone. Also increased the range, so it changed things a little bit. But what we're seeing now, like that was a tactical improvement that has been changing the battlefield entirely. Now we see a strategic change because it's really hard to deter an adversary from shipping a handful of containers. That's like no intelligence agency in the world can credibly claim that they will find every single one of those. And that now means that this commercial technology suddenly is changing the, strategic game, and you have to rethink that. There are, of course, answers, and most NATO countries still have their hardened shelters. So there is always a defense to the offense, but I think we have to basically, this notion of that you have something that's thousands or tens of thousands of miles away from a front line and is safe there, that's gone. And it's gone at a ridiculously low price point. And I think what I also want to stress here, what has been employed in the attack is hobbyist gear. That's online, and I would say the intelligence part of the operation, and I have no particular insights there, but the intelligence part of the operation must have been really good and really clever and all that, and I'm not an expert on that. On the technology side, this was the most straightforward thing that any technologist could think of, and you could literally do that as a student project because all the components are out there. So very sophisticated operation with incredibly accessible means, which means that any country in the world, and not just countries, also non-state actors, should be assumed to be capable of doing that. And I've actually been saying for the last decade or so, thank God that terrorists are dumb, because I was waiting for this moment. And so I think we have to also think about the fact that now, unfortunately, the world has been shown you can do this, you can get away with it, and it doesn't have to be just strategic tankers. So I do think we need to rethink air defense in a very profound way.
So we were on a panel in Washington as part of this big expo on AI right before I came here. And we had a conversation with somebody from the US administration. We were talking about spiderweb. And this was on the record comments. And he said, we saw that, and I can tell you we can't do it, nor can we defend against it. But it sounds like what you're saying right now is no, actually anybody can do it, but it's true that we can't really defend against it, right?
I can, certainly anybody can do it, yes. It's like, and if you look at a lot of cargo drone startups and university projects, it's the exact same thing. You connect a drone to the internet, you remotely control it. And I also want to point out, the effect of the attack was very impressive, but the video is actually giving away the whole UI, and you can clearly see those drones were flown manually. So somebody said, fly to this position on the wing, and then for those of us who have been to Ukraine, usually the trigger is like two metal wires that, if bent together, trigger the charge. So it's like the means employed are very, very straightforward and are the exact same things that have been used, millions of units of those have been used on the front line in Ukraine. What's different here is the sophisticated logistics to get some of these systems at the same time, thousands of miles across the country.
Yeah.
That is very sophisticated. I don't know how many people can do that or organizations can do that. On the technology side, I can say we could do a hackathon over 48 hours with student teams, and out of 20 teams, we would get 12 of them to be able to carry out this attack one-to-one. We actually did prove that on a NATO hackathon a year ago in Krakow, where we gave student teams and also companies drones. We taught them how to write apps, and the first team had, after just 4 hours AI-based terminal guidance targeting done, and was approaching a Polish military vehicle. We were not allowed to fly into them. It would have been more spectacular, but it worked. And so 4 hours. 4 hours.
Wow.
And so I think we have to be cognizant of the fact that the technological barrier is so incredibly low. At the same time, we're now also, and I think drones start to be a little bit like cyber. There's offensive and defensive. We as a company start to be working heavily on air defense. And it's the exact same drones that are being used for ground-to-ground. And Rheinmetall has just come out with a press release showing the effectors that are powered by Auterion OS taking out drones. So there's a cure to this. If you have a container with your own drones on base and a not so expensive, relatively straightforward radar, you can take this out. It's just that we've now seen a technological, I wouldn't even seen a technological leap, an operational brilliance leap that actually was obvious for any technologist. And yes, it will change how air defense works, and maybe those good old NATO shelters will all be crowded again soon.
Well, before we get to that dystopian vision, Auterion actually came up in the previous panel, so your reputation precedes you. We were talking about the lessons learned from the battlefield in Ukraine, and I mentioned that you have been deploying in Ukraine at increasing rates over the course of the full-scale invasion. What have you been up to, and what have you learned?
So some of these operations are classified. Some are more visible. I would say that a few of the things we've done are on Twitter, but we prefer to not make that connection. But if you look at some videos closely, not Spiderweb, but if you look at other videos closely, you can basically see that UI looks familiar. We've scaled from initially special operations in the hundreds to tens of thousands this year. So we're in good distribution there. And then I think one thing that I actually want to pioneer a little bit, and it sounds so basic, is to bring Ukrainian learnings into Western militaries. And to bring that in with the humility that the world-leading technology on drones is right now in Ukraine. There's unfortunately also pretty good technology on the Russian side, which we should not ignore, but that doesn't matter to us. And what I'm finding, so this is maybe a perfect segue, what I'm finding, we're quite unique. I don't know if there's any other company like us, because we build software and guidance computers, and we work with Ukrainian manufacturers. We also work with American and Dutch and German manufacturers, but in Ukraine, the large number of units is powered by Ukrainian companies. So we're not trying to cook up a new solution in Munich or Silicon Valley and try to ship it there. We're truly partnering. And we're also doing the reverse. So we brought a Ukrainian company that builds a long-range drone with 1,000 miles range, 1,500 kilometers, into a DoD program. And there are others that do that too, but I think that was the first time. And what I would love to see in Europe and in the US, where we're based, are two things. A little bit more humility towards the Ukrainian players, because they're not cobbling just stuff together. It's actually really sophisticated. And they're very humble about it, and they're willing to share. Almost every company tells you exactly what the secret insight is that makes this stuff work. It's an innovation ecosystem. And to take them seriously and to build partnerships how they can access the Western market, because that will give us all better technology at the mass scale price points that we need. For comparison, an Andrew loitering munition is $500,000. The Ukrainian equivalent is maybe $20,000 and more battle tested. And we need affordable mass. Like, the way to counter Russian and Chinese mass is with affordable autonomous mass. And these Ukrainian partners can do that. That's one important learning. The other important learning is I run right now a lot into the conversation around like, oh, we need to do requirements engineering and testing, and we need to do some early RDT&E in our militaries, because that's the usual cycle. And that is interesting because like we have TRL-9, so combat-proven systems in Ukraine that we could readily adopt, but right now what I see a lot in government programs is, oh, we'll do some innovation stuff first, and then in 5 years we have a system. And that's actually, in a way, locking out Ukrainian companies because it makes the fact that they have a finished product, it devalues it because the system says, I don't want to buy a finished product. I don't want to buy 10,000 units. I want to buy 2, and preferably from our national industry. So I would encourage the West, in order to stay competitive with Russia and to get ready for China, because we don't have 5 to 7 years for China, to try to say like, okay, we want to do some RDT&E, but we also want some scale partnerships with Ukrainian technology, maybe European or American prime. There's industrial policy that is valid. There's supply chain concerns that are valid. A lot of these Ukrainian companies are, from their setup, from their financial setup, complex. So they're all reasons. But you can adopt technology today, and you should bring that into your forces, and you should use it as a forcing function to change your force design.
Exactly.
So I think those things, we need a lot more of that because we don't have time. And one of the largest defense prime in Taiwan just released a video this week showing our terminal guidance solution on a Taiwanese drone with all the learnings out of Ukraine with a real warhead striking targets. We are in Taiwan today. We're not doing research. We're doing tech transfer out of Ukraine right away. And for some of these near-peer adversaries, we are potentially on a 2-year clock. So we don't have that 5-year cycle.
So I think you brought up something really important, a lot of important issues that if we had 2 hours, we could get into. But I think one is the tech export from Ukraine directly to Taiwan. I mean, this is a completely new vector, but more and more, this will have to be the kind of cycle that we will have to all kind of get with to understand what are the consequences, the lessons, but also the real-time applications that can be applied now, not a year from now or 2 years from now, into potential battle scenarios of the future, right? And, you know, I was struck by a conversation that you and I had, I think at the last NATO summit in Washington, where we talked about the adaptation cycle, right? And how rapidly it's happening and that we don't have a lot of time. And I remember what you said then, which was that in Ukraine, the adaptation cycle, meaning how fast the Russians are able to adapt to the changes Ukrainians are making in the autonomous capability space writ large, is 2 weeks. And every 2 weeks, you're going to have to update and update and update, and then they're catching up and catching up. Is that still the case today from your experience? And if so, who do you think has the competitive advantage right now?
I think it's pretty much a cat and mouse game that is really, really close. And like, and the tactics, by the way, are evolving. We're seeing now, if you go on Twitter, you see Russian videos reposted from Telegram shooting down Ukrainian ISR drones with interceptors. You see the same from Ukrainian drones. You now see a lot of Russian drones that fly evasive maneuvers when they detect an interceptor. Like, no NATO kit is currently capable of doing that. And that would mean that even if we now adopt ISR drones on the brigade level, if we face a near-peer adversary like Russia or China, those ISR drones would be gone within the first 10 minutes. Not with like expensive air defense missiles, but with like some FPVs they're launching and queuing with a cheap ground-based radar they have. So I think we have to get on that cycle. And to be on that cycle, you have to be regularly in Ukraine, and you have to be working with the companies there, and not just testing your stuff. Because I've seen almost every Western defense startup claiming they've tested their stuff. And then when I'm in Kiev, I'm asking, like, okay, have you heard anything? Is anybody using this? And the answer is like, no. And you can even see that from the announcements of those companies themselves, because if they were selling at scale into Ukraine, they would be talking about the hundreds of millions of dollars they're making. And if they're not talking about it, they're probably not selling at scale.
Yeah. So Europe is supposedly spending on defense now. I say supposedly because there's a process, and when the money will actually get into the pockets of companies and go into development, all of that is still a question mark. But certainly, defense and security is back on the agenda in a big way. There are serious steps that are being taken by the EU, by individual nation states, also by NATO. Obviously, the big conversation is how will Europe fill the gap of a U.S., maybe not withdrawal, but definitely drawdown. That is happening. But it's going to take a long time for Europe to build an actual army. There is no European army, there is no NATO army, right? You're not going to build a defense industrial base overnight. But you can build a lot of drones very, very quickly. So with the conversation earlier was really focused on how do national armies also integrate autonomous capabilities into their force structure and force posture. But I think there's a bigger vision there that maybe we all need to think about, and I've heard you talk about before. What do you think the future force is actually going to look like, given the kind of innovation that's taking place today?
So I think I think the German's Zeitenwende is the perfect example of the right vision and then a different execution. Now I have more hope since that has been re-energized now, but this happens a lot. And for example, from a force design perspective, the chief of the British Army has said a few things that are, I think, bang on. 50% of procurement should go into new autonomous systems. So not like 90%, 50%, which is a big change. And quite frankly, I only believe you can realistically do that if you almost double your defense budget, because otherwise you have all these turf fights that will take years to resolve. And he also expects that in the future, 80% of kinetic effects on the target will be delivered by autonomous systems. Not 100%. I don't think that tanks, artillery, or fighter jets will go away, because they project the mass force, the mass kinetic effects on the battlefield. They effectively hold lines. But beyond their range, you have now autonomous systems that, and I'm totally expecting drone against drone combat as sort of the first phase of any future conflict. And so what does that mean? Well, it means, I think honestly, it means really two things. Number one, you need to increase your defense spending if you realistically want to adopt quickly, because otherwise the turf fights on maintaining your existing tanks will consume everything. So I think a few countries, Poland, Germany, others, are on a good track. I think there's some interesting development in the Nordics. The Brits have the right vision, but I haven't seen the budget move accordingly. So it's going to be hard, because they would need to make really hard decisions. And after just announcing 16 new submarines, that if you had announced 15, you could actually buy a lot of autonomous systems. So I think that's the one thing. And then again, the other thing is, do not go into the RDT&E and whatever cycle, because basically what that means, the first thing you'll do is you slow everything down, you distribute the money across Europe, and you're not accelerating the companies that have proven on the battlefield that they actually create value. So I think what Europe should do is buy tens of thousands of drones right now. And what I often see when I talk to procurement or military is they're saying, oh, but in 2 years they're old, and how can we make sure that we don't spend money right now, but you build as industry the perfect technology, and you scale your company, and you can make millions of things, but we don't want to buy. We like to say in the defense industry, spending money is very different than making money. And so I think what would be really important, and if you all can carry that forward into the organizations you're working with, is buy drones. And if you're worried that they get outdated, send them to Ukraine and Taiwan. They will be put to good use, because that's way better spent money than forking out research grants and slowing everything down. If you want an industry, you need to buy from an industry. If you put out R&D grants, what will happen is that you create a whole researchy environment with no accountability for performance.
Because de facto, the research is being done on the battlefield in Ukraine, being tested, researched all at the same time. So Lawrence, I appreciate your comments and your vision for the future. I think often we have these conversations, I'm struck with how much opportunity there is for NATO and Europe to really, I think, jumpstart their capabilities and build a future force, not the force necessarily even for today, but the force for a year from now, 2 years from now. But you have to take risk, I think is the point you're making. And that's a very different cultural notion or perspective here in Europe than is in the United States or in the private sector, right? Where risk aversion seems to still dominate. So my last, just very, very, very brief, because I know we're out of time. Do you see that changing? Do you see Europe becoming less risk averse?
I mean, certainly the case. But still, these R&D, this R&D view is not exactly that. Like the Dutch, for example, they're just buying drones. The Danish are just buying drones. That's taking risk. Yeah, they might not work, they might be outdated, but they have moved things forward. One thing I also want to stress, which is not in line of your question, but it is super important. Drones are not aircraft. They are munitions. And if NATO should learn anything from the 155 millimeter debacle, you have to drive interoperability on drones. If you field a NATO force of drones of German and Portuguese and British that are not on the same language and cannot run the same software, right, you will have the equivalent of a NATO without English. And when you make contact with the enemy who speaks consistently Russian or consistently Chinese, you will completely lose against the drone swarms. And so I cannot stress enough that right now all the European nations are trying to create their national champion. So it's again the 155 motion. And I think what has to happen, and yes, this is also self-serving because we've seen that problem, we're trying to solve it, you have to separate software and hardware. You have to buy those separately. If you buy software and hardware separately, you can drive standardization. But if you're buying vertically integrated, monolithic systems, the vendors will always find a way to lock you in. And the problem of that is that you will not have those swarms. I'm looking at the commander of the European forces. Like, you wouldn't be able to employ your whole forces. You would have like these different things. So this is maybe the most important thing that nobody's thinking about.
Sounds like you're saying open source.
Well, not necessarily open source. We don't want the Russians to have all the latest kit.
Secure, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Open standards.
Open standards.
And the same software.
Yeah.
Yes.
So Lawrence, I think you also just gave me a quick opportunity to plug a CEPA paper that is, I think, out there on the tables that looks at interoperability in the digital domain across NATO lines, so how we can avoid exactly what you're talking about right now with this move towards sovereignty, which we all understand, but that sovereignty shouldn't come at the cost of a lack of interoperability in the military space.
And the trick there is sovereignty means you have your own supply chains, you have your own factories, you have a copy of the software. The good thing about software is it can be copied, right? It can be shared. A factory is hard to share. It's either here or it's there. but software can be in both places. And so that's an opportunity to have both sovereignty on a national level, but interoperability on a Western Alliance level.
So, Lawrence, I think that's a fantastic note to end on. Thank you so much for your time. Thanks for your insights. Let's all join me in thanking Lawrence Meyer, the CEO of Aterion. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lawrence. This is awesome. Everyone, please stay seated. I'd like to now move on to our final panel of the day, and I'd like to welcome my colleague from Washington, Rona Murphy, director of our technology policy program, to introduce our next panel. Thanks,
Thank you very
Rona.
much, Alina, and thank you everybody for coming. The title of this panel is Compass Point, and we're trying to understand Europe's tech and security priorities. And we'll bring our guests on stage in one moment. I think that it speaks to what CEPA tries to focus upon much of the time, which is that overlap between technology policy, security policy. That's what this conference is about. That's what the events we've been hosting have been about. That's many of the conversations we've been having and the reports that we write. So hopefully the group that we bring up today will shed a bit of light on what's happening here, and we'll talk a little bit about what the implications are for the transatlantic relationship and what's happening today in that sense. So I might welcome our panel on stage when we just be careful with the step with everybody coming up. We're all helpfully labeled where everyone's going to sit. So I'll make very, very quick introductions and forgive the mangling of names. I'm Ronan, I can pronounce my own name most of the time, but for everyone else, we're joined by the director of the Digital Society Trust and Cybersecurity in DG Connect, and that is Christian Korkatep de Veron. Hope you did okay there. I'll skip down to your fellow Dane, Casper Klinge from Zscaler has joined us. We have Tommy Hoodman from the Wilfred Martens Centre here in Brussels, so many of you will be familiar with Tommy. And last but by no means least is CEPA Senior Fellow Lucinda Creighton, also a former minister in the Irish Government, responsibility for European affairs, and leads her own consultancy here and in Dublin, Vulcan Consulting. And Christian, I'm going to come to you first, if I may. DG Connect, how do you balance Europe's quest for innovation, for competitiveness? We have Compass Point in the title for a reason. There is a plan in place. How do you balance that against the European joy in regulation, shall we say?
Yeah, thank you. That's a very hot topic these days. Indeed, it is. So I think the starting point for us is always, of course, to also remind people that if there's a European joy for regulation, it's also because we really want to avoid having 27 different regulations, right? We have an internal market. So when we make European rules, it is in a way a good start to actually already help us have an internal market for our companies that want to sell throughout the Union and not deal with 27 different regimes. Then, of course, the key thing when we regulate, I think, it's to do it in a way that's proportionate, risk-based, etc. And this is a job. I work on cybersecurity, as you said. And in my field, we've been very busy. Let's be honest. We've been very busy regulating because we have seen that there is a need to also raise security standards within our critical entities, in our products, etc. Now, on the one hand, I think it's important when, of course, we do this regulation, and importantly, when we implement it, that we give space to our industry, that we bring our industry on board. And I heard also before we were talking about the standards, because I think for me, the standards is really the key place where we bring our regulation to life for our industry, but where we also work very closely with our industry for them to be able to also define, help us define what actually regulation means in practice. The other thing is, of course, that, innovation, you also need money for it. And I think we heard a little bit before also around how do we create our industry around it. I like to go around and remind people that with our cyber frameworks, we're creating a gigantic market opportunity for cybersecurity companies, for managed security services, for everyone who's operating in the security field, because all our critical entities now need to do proper cybersecurity, and they will not be doing that on their own. So we're creating a market here, and I think it's important that when we're creating this market, we're also conscious about, what do we need to support a European industry developing around this? Do we have what it takes in terms of having a cybersecurity industry in Europe? Where are the gaps, etc.? So these are things that we need to sort of match together in the package. And then, of course, I wouldn't be sitting where I sit, and I wouldn't be sitting in Brussels if I didn't say the hot word simplification, because it's everywhere. And of course, this is also something that we are taking very, very seriously. You will have heard my Executive Vice President Virkkunen. It's like top priority for her. She has mandated everyone in Connect, and I'm telling you, it's happening. Everything is on the table now. We're doing a proper review of everything around digital space. But as I'm also doing cybersecurity, I'm certainly also looking a little bit beyond what I have myself on my desk, looking at what are all the rules and regulations in place, whether it's sectorial or horizontal, or something to say, where do we find cybersecurity requirements? How do all of these things actually fit with what we have in our frameworks? Are there overlaps? Are there places where we can reduce the burden? And we're having very good discussions, of course, with our industry around this as well. And I'm really happy for people to come with concrete things, not just telling me that everything is bad, but concrete things that we can fix, because the door is very, very open for this right now.
Okay. When we come to you, Kasper, somebody is in the private sector now. You've hopped the fence somewhat, former tech ambassador for Denmark. Tell me, is this what you feel? Is innovation, is simplification something you can feel coming in the commercial world for Zscaler today?
I thought this panel was about Greenland. No, it's a bad joke when you're Danish, and sorry to have two Danes in front of you. But Christiane is so desperate to be on panels with me that she follows me around the world to these kind of interventions. Listen, I think it's great, and I'll tease Christiane a little bit, to have the European Commission talk about simplification. And of course, it is sort of the buzzword of today. And let's be honest, for good reasons, because I do think that Europe is sort of at a critical time and space. In the private sector, we often talk about the importance of a level playing field. You would talk about, equal implementation across EU 27. But I think the problem right now is, of course, you don't have geopolitical level playing field. It's a very different situation right now. And Europe is under pressure. I think there is a sense here in Europe, I'm European with a capital E, that we can no longer trust the transatlantic relationship the way we used to trust it. And I think it creates a whole set of unprecedented challenges for all of us. I'll come back to the simplification process in a second. But I do want to say, having been in sort of the diplomatic world or in foreign ministries in the European Union and NATO myself, I think people often underestimate how dramatic a change in the psychology and the mindset of people we've seen in the last 3 to 4 months. I have to say, I think when you travel in Europe, and it's great to have Alina here and CEPA here, when you speak to European decision makers, of course politicians, but even in the private sector, the way they think about Europe right now, the way they think about sovereignty, the way they think about autonomy, and the way, unfortunately for those of us with a very big transatlantic heart, the way they think about the US as a partner is fundamentally different compared to anything we've seen before. And I think that puts a lot of things in question. I think for the European Union, how can we do a lot more on our own? And I think the efforts of the European Commission or the European institutions are necessary. They might be a little bit late because we don't have this blooming technology industry in Europe, but better late than never. But I also think, and of course I get my salary to say that, I think it puts in question sort of fundamental aspects about the ability of responsible US technology companies operating in Europe on European terms and supplying into the digital sovereignty space. That has become much more difficult in the last couple of months. We understand why, but some of us are a bit concerned about what that means for the transatlantic partnership, but also what it means in terms of European resilience at a moment where, as we've just heard, the threats against Europe are pretty high and unprecedented as well.
Okay, and Tommy, that sort of leads into, I mean, you mentioned Greenland, which we're not going to talk about in any great detail here, but I mean, it's part of a wider conversation. We partnered with Wilfred Martin Centre on a report on the TTC, for instance, which is no more as it stands, but it was a Trade and Technology Council. It was something it was an attempt for transatlantic cooperation at a time, and it operated and it worked. Where do you see, does what Casper said, does that ring true for you? Does it change in the last 3 months? And where do you see this transatlantic work go from here?
I will come back to Greenland. No, thank you. First of all, thank you, CEPA. Thank you, Alina, having this possibility to continue discussion. Indeed, with CEPA, Martin Center, we published a paper on TTC. You're saying it's totally dead. I think that's not totally the case. But I think that's the question which direction we go. I think on that, on TTC, to kind of continue where we stopped last time, is that I think there's a good news and bad news. I think the good news is that I think what we presented, so everybody remembers we had the catastrophe of TTIP. Then we understood that, okay, let's make it, well, those who are involved in trade, they know that what you speak in a political level is very different what happens in the trade negotiations. Let's go more technical, little bit off the radar. And then we had the 10 working groups and all of that. And then the CEPA Martin Center point was that, okay, listen, you need to be a little bit more concrete, have a concrete projects, a little bit more mandate, try to maybe upgrade it time to time, maybe have even summits and include different actors. And what, one could say that's all these reasons why TTC was formed, a little bit have an early warning system of the problems in the trade, also a little bit handle the first Trump administration dynamic. I think it's very valid, and I think that remains. So that's the good news. Now the bad news, Greenland. So basically the whole political situation, we know that now as the trade negotiations are going on about the percentage, all these institutions and the councils do not matter at the moment. I think they expect it, but then you could think that, okay, we have this situation going on, let's wait that the dust will settle and then we go back business as usual, we model these discussions in the council. But there's several issues. I think at least here in the Brussels side, the feeling is, first of all, and please, if there's somebody who can, challenge me, please feel welcome, that at least from the US side, there is no much will to continue with this TTC. So they don't see it very positively from our side. Well, there's many, depending who you speak. There is one view that very much this China topic came because the setting, of course, China was one of the issues to be discussed in the TTC, but that seemed to come through very, very forcefully. Third problem is the challenge is that very clearly during as you mentioned, last 1-2 years, this geopolitics has, connected very strong to trade. So it's very difficult then to deal with issues in a kind of technical platform. So to conclude, so what could happen? I would argue that the whole concept is good, especially with our CEPA Martin Center advice. It would be even better. But realistically, you have to relaunch the concept somehow. I don't know, make it Trump, trade, technology, defense council, and take it from there. You kind of need to revamp it and take it from there. But I think we should argue it's an important platform. We should continue with that.
Oh, thank you, Tommy. And Lucinda, I think there's the transatlantic relationship and there's what can happen there on both sides and what that means for European competitiveness and so on. But there's also what Europe has to do for itself. Yeah. And we have several reports on the table from one Finnish, 2 Italian for politicians, the Draghi report, the Letter report, and so on. What can Europe do for itself? And you can address, if you wish, what we should be doing and could be doing on the transatlantic front. And I would add, Alina mentioned it earlier, we've hosted several events this week of the grouping from the S&D, or a delegation of the S&D grouping from Parliament with us in Washington on Tuesday, and we hosted a panel with the EU ambassador on Monday. There is a tension there. There's a tension. So go ahead.
I think yes, that's probably a slight understatement, but it's a good starting point. I mean, I think a few things. I think obviously, when we gather in these sort of environments, we tend to focus on the geopolitical broad environment and how it's changing and has changed, and we're all aware of that. And there's obviously a big focus on what's happening in Washington, because not least it's a great reality TV show and it's highly entertaining, if obviously massively concerning. But actually, politics has changed here in Europe as well, and I think that's really important to put it in context. There are similar dynamics, maybe not as pronounced in Europe as we have seen in the US. And, we've had some quite controversial elections here in Europe. We have seen changes in EU member states, and we've seen major change in the European Commission and indeed in the Parliament in terms of the political leadership. So it's, the irony is that the mood music here in Europe should be a lot more, I would say, at least objectively, much more pro-Atlanticist. We have a very pro-innovation, a very pro-business sort of outlook that perhaps has been slightly lacking for the last 5 years, I would argue. And actually the drive now from, we'll say the greater representation of the centre-right in the European Commission, that changes the dynamic. And you see it reflected in the priorities of the Commission, and you see it in some of the calls coming from the Parliament. And there are really interesting dynamics even towards the end of the last Commission, where the Parliament was actually calling out the Commission in certain policy areas and certain initiatives, saying you need to listen to industry, you need to be more responsive. That's a change, because, I think a lot of people here who've been in the lobbying business or who've been in the policy churn for a long time would say it's usually the opposite way around. Okay, so that should be a real positive, and it should be a moment where the European Union is coming together to sort of work constructively with the US on a lot of the things that we have mutual concerns about, like China, like competitiveness, like relevance in this changing geopolitical environment, and the value and the need for the transatlantic sort of cohesion that we would like to see. But things changed on January 20th, and we don't need to get into some of the rhetoric that has caused a lot of sort of emotional, I would say, and emotive response here in Europe, and has definitely seen a breakdown in trust at a moment when actually trust should be at an all-time high. So it's really unfortunate. All is not lost, I would say. The other obvious context is the war in Ukraine, and Europe, irrespective of what's happening in Washington, and I think the legitimate demands for Europe to do more to secure itself, to defend itself, and to be innovative, is that Europe is talking about this anyway. So the war in Ukraine has changed the context. Governments have been spending more and have been committing to spend more on the collective European security and defence. And these conversations are changed. It's reflected in new members of NATO. I mean, in Finland and Sweden joining NATO, something that has been a long-standing political discourse in those countries, but it took, the invasion of Ukraine and the fallout from that to actually see this actually happen. And the debates have changed in all of the other countries as well, including the neutrals. And let's not forget that we have neutrals. I'm from one of them, who are now, procuring and spending a lot more on their own and collective European security and defence. And I think that that's an interesting sort of thing that is happening organically, irrespective of what's happening in Washington. And then we get to the broad competitiveness agenda, the Draghi report. And that, again, is focusing on things that, some of us have been arguing Europe has taken its eye off and really needs to refocus on. And that is our own security, cyber, and sort of traditional security and defence, innovation and spending on innovation. And this is where sometimes the rhetoric is mismatched with the reality, because we have big ambitions, and I think there's a lot of political buy-in in Europe, in the institutions and in the member state governments. You've seen a big shift in some of the larger member states. I'm thinking of France particularly, where President Macron, I think it's fair to say the French have been the drivers of a lot of this regulatory agenda, this discussion of strategic autonomy, which some interpret as, protectionism. And actually, President Macron has completely changed his rhetoric on this. And we're seeing a lot more openness to a collective European response to, supporting innovation and so on, aligned with Draghi and embracing what Draghi has proposed for the European Union, but the devil is in the detail. And this is where the challenge is. And I have great sympathy for friends and colleagues working in the European institutions trying to square that circle where, we have this collective ambition, but different member states have different interpretations of how that will be achieved. And when you get into the detail of the regulatory frameworks, you get into the detail of simplification, that's where the battles really start to kick off. There's a lot more I could say on that, but I think that's just maybe to frame it in terms of, a lot of this sort of change that's being demanded from Washington, from Europe, is happening anyway. We need to accelerate it. We have big targets. There's 800 billion committed for investment in security and defence. How do we roll that out? How do we mobilise it? How do we ensure it doesn't get locked into that research side without the deployment and the everything Lawrence has spoken about, which is absolutely correct. But at the same time, we do need to invest in R&D, and that's very clear in Draghi. But there's a lot that can happen without all of that huge expenditure, and a massive part of that is nobody wants to call it deregulation. That's what we're talking about. We need to deregulate in Europe. We've overregulated across all sectors. And how do we do that? But while ensuring that we can have better symmetry between member states within the single market. That, again, is really challenging. It's easy to say in theory, much more difficult to achieve in reality.
Yeah, and I'll come back to you about that in a second, Christian. But Tommy, I think you wanted to come in there on... Yeah, I just wanted to
actually second what Lucinda and Casper spoke about trust, because that's what we were speaking about current transatlantic relations. What is very striking is that in Washington, I think what Casper said, that change here in Europe is not fully understood. I think it's understandable. I think in Washington bubble, many of them are, has lost jobs. They are fighting the funding of their organization. The focus is on domestic politics. But I have to really just give a concrete example. I had a discussion with somebody from Heritage Foundation, which it's a little bit notorious, close to Trump world. But the person, quite high level, was astonished to learn that, give an example, Finland, as you mentioned, has now joined the NATO, European Union, of course, but NATO, and it's fully committed very much on transatlantic, also US relation, etc. But the fact is that 70% of the population thinks that if we have a war, and they're preparing for that, if we have war, the US will not come. US will not come. And so this person was like, how can this be? How can this be? And so that one point, and exactly as Lucinda said, that I think the irony of the situation is that we have a lot of elements, like in the, here in our bubble, you have a, new commission, which is more open. We know the difference between what happens and the rhetoric, but, deregulation, and I would claim also the current Henna Virkkunen, is much more, very pragmatic. And then, as mentioned, you have the whole defense issue, also going back to the TTTC. So you have, we are saving now we're kind of undoing Brexit with this whole defense cooperation topic. So that should be very natural platform, also with relations with the United States. So it's a pity that we're losing a lot of energy now because of this rhetorics.
No, thank you, Tommy. To bring it back to what's being done and what will be done here in Brussels, and as Lucinda alluded to, a lot of this was happening anyway. And maybe I'd be guilty of this myself, sort of teenage reaction. I was going to do that anyway. Don't tell me to do it, That's not an excuse. We can still get on with the business. If for Europe to be competitive, particularly when it comes to technology, and the competitive compass has set some ambitious targets in that regard. There's talk about sovereignty. There's talking about building European champions. But in practical terms, there's no path forward that doesn't involve suppliers from outside the EU, particularly from the US when it comes to things like AI and cloud. How do you factor that in? And I'm assuming US firms aren't a problem for the future of your plans for competitiveness. How do you factor all that in?
I think, the way, of course, we're working on this now is that, we remain an open economy. I think our line has always been that we set requirements, we set the standards, we define, if you're coming from a security perspective, we are also looking at what are the security requirements. There are areas where, of course, there's an interest to have European companies, especially for specifically very sensitive sectors, as we already see, there's nothing new there. And I think the way we're looking at it is also to say, but of course, companies that meet these requirements that we can trust, these are the ones where they're always welcome. And I think there's a lot of discussion going around that. I think what Casper is also referring to, I think it's not so much necessarily at the policy level or the political level, but what is happening when he goes to see his vendors, right? Or the people who buy from him. I think that's where you have maybe also a very big shift of mindset, because for our side, of course, we set the frameworks, we set the rules. That is one part. The other part is, I think there is, especially, I mean, I look at it, of course, in the security field, and more specifically cybersecurity, cyber defense, it's an area where we practically do not have industry. I mean, very, very little European industries in this field. And it is a resilience issue that we don't have European industry here. We need to also be able to draw on our own industry. And I think, for me, this fits very well into the whole discussion around also us taking charge of our own security. It means that we have to be able to also rely on companies. We see when we have very, very big, large-scale incidents, and we've seen them in the past, the really big ones, right? They rock the world. So we need to be able to ensure that we have the capacity here, because we cannot expect, certain companies, like everyone will have their own market they will have to look after. We need to also have the capacity in Europe to deal with these things. We need to have the reserve in Europe to be able to deal if there is a very large incident. And I think those are the things that we also need to think about when we have our discussions around preparedness, when we have our discussions around resilience. We need to factor in, this level of being sure that we can also deliver for our own critical entities.
Yeah, okay, Casper, you want to?
Well, I mean, just a couple of points on this. I mean, I think, if I wasn't clear before, let me be crystal clear, as Christian helped me on this one. Yes, it's not only a political or public sector phenomena. I mean, we're hearing this from our customers, including big customers in Europe. And there are two things they're saying to us, and bear with me for a second. One is, of course, the obvious concern about US technology per se. That's the obvious one. Trump administration, the dialogue that is ongoing, naturally it has an impact on customers or companies in Europe as well. The other one, which is very interesting, is the political risk associated with buying US technology. And of course, those two things are related, but it's not completely the same, which means that especially, not least in the public sector, you have high-level decision makers that are afraid of going down the US technology road because of political concerns in terms of what risk it entails for them to take those decisions. And I think that says a little bit about how different the environment is right now in Europe. Now, what do we do about it? And, needless to say, I will have to say what I'm going to say now, so I know that I have no credibility, but I will do it nonetheless. What we would like to see in Europe, and where we're hoping that Christian and Virkunen and others will help, is to allow nuances and differentiation when you look at the market in Europe. What I'm saying here is, of course, the companies that adhere to supporting digital sovereignty, control, making sure data sets are not, violated, distributed. And what I think is the most important thing these days, I mean, we've been talking about, and colleagues in uniform or previously in uniform will know this very well. Of course, a lot of concerns about intelligence access to personal data sets in Europe. That's still, of course, a discussion point. But these days, I would argue that risks or concerns around traditional espionage is moving up the ladder. European customers, European companies are incredibly concerned about whether their data sets are going to be misused, monetized, innovated on the basis of outside the European Union. So what we're hoping for is, of course, those companies that can offer that kind of ring fencing, protection. In our case, we do not share or keep the content of our customers. They will be allowed to operate in Europe. And the last thing, which is a controversial point to mention here, I hope that I will get an ice cream from Christian after this. I actually think in order to progress digital sovereignty, in some areas you need more regulation. I'm willing to go into a bet here on whatever drinking subject you would like to go into. I think it's going to be very difficult for the European Commission to avoid introducing new regulation in order to promote autonomy or digital sovereignty. Because, of course, what does this entail to promote European industry? Well, you need to partner up with European companies. You need to make sure you share innovations. You need to make sure you share technologies. You need to make sure it's crystal clear that you do not misuse data sets. How do you do that on a voluntary basis? I stand to be corrected. In my view, you will see introductions of new regulations to try and promote digital sovereignty. I know Christiane is going to disagree with me on this one, but let's meet again in 5 years' time and see who was right.
Okay, well, let's hope we don't have to wait 5 years to find anything out here. I mean, we're going to go for Q&A very briefly, but Lucinda, I might come back to you. I want to just quote directly from our previous speaker to the keynote, Lorenz here from Oterion. If you want to build an industry, you have to buy from it. And that sounds an awful lot like adoption to me. I mean, the adoption gap is a concern, I think, in lots of fronts. We've heard stats mentioned when it comes to AI, but technology in general, cloud adoption, etc. I'm assuming you don't agree that new regulation is the way forward there. There is money in a pot from COVID that still hasn't been spent on lots of fronts. What would you like to see the Commission do to move that along in Europe in general, and the member states who are responsible for their own work as well?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose I think it's wrong to frame this as an either-or option. So I think if you come at this from the competitiveness and innovation standpoint, just from through that lens, if you like, it makes sense to want to support an ecosystem which allows new technologies, dual-use technologies, deep tech, etc., to thrive in Europe. That's logical. But I think that there are a couple of factors to that. It's not as simple as deciding, well, we're going to regulate to make it happen, or we're going to spend a lot of public funds to make it happen. It's simply, if it were that simple, it would have happened already. We've all sorts of programs under our multi-annual financial frameworks going back decades that have sort of tried to achieve that, but it hasn't happened. And there are a couple of factors. One is culture, risk. So we are as Europeans more averse to risk than our US counterparts. That's a fact, and that's something that I think has to be incentivized and encouraged. We are dependent, so that's the starting point. We are dependent on US technology. So for European technology to flourish, we have no alternative but to work with and adopt US technology, both civilian and in the military sphere. So I think that's an incontrovertible fact as well. And the other point is capital. So I alluded to the Draghi proposal, some of which is around deregulation and is eminently logical and sensible and relatively cost-free. The other is, ramping up significant public investment, which needs to happen and will happen. And I mean, it would require a multi-annual financial framework to increase about sevenfold. That's what's so currently the 7-year multi-annual financial framework is about 1.4 trillion. And under the Draghi proposals, that will have to increase dramatically. So that's needed. But the other point is that we have a complete lack of capital in Europe. So Capital Markets Union is a chimera that we have all aspired to, and we've talked about it since I was Minister for European Affairs during the financial crisis, where I attended every EU summit, banking union, capital markets union, all of this, and it hasn't materialized. And that's, again, it's because while we all have these big common ambitions, when you get down to the nitty-gritty, there are sovereignty issues dressed up, if you like, as maybe protectionist. It depends on your perspective, I suppose. But the fact is that we haven't been able to reach political agreement. Now we have a bit more imperative for it, and we have Draghi, that report sort of pushing. So let's see. And we've changed the name. It's no longer Capital Markets Union, so maybe that helps. But that is important. We need to mobilize private capital to work with the public, and we cannot achieve these goals if we don't do that. So if we want to innovate and if we want to build these digital capabilities in Europe, we need that capital to emerge. And just one interesting, stat is that, the sort of purchasing power of Europeans, average Europeans, is about 30% less than the US. but we have far more savings in Europe, but we can't mobilize those savings through pension funds and through investment tools. So these are really important questions. We can have all of the regulation and all of the aspiration that we want, but if we cannot fund these ambitions, we'll still be here. We will still be here in 5 years talking about this. So this is the challenge for the Eurogroup, for my good friend Pascal Donoghue in his role as Eurogroup president, and for the Commission and all of the member state capitals working together. But hopefully, you know, the global uncertainty that we are experiencing, the negatives that we are seeing in the transatlantic relationship might just spur some of this to happen more rapidly. And certainly that's my silver lining in all of this, is that I feel that, you know, this impetus is here now with us here in Brussels in particular, but also in the other European capitals. A final point I'd like to make, sort of unconnected, is it's great to see Chancellor Merz in Washington today. This is really positive. As we all know, he's an Atlanticist. He believes in the relationship. It's very broken from the German perspective at the moment, but this is an important move. But I really want to see the President of the Commission sitting in the Oval Office, meeting with...
I think she wants as well.
Yeah. But we've got to push for this to happen. Okay. And I think that, you know, talking about transatlantic tech dialogue, talking about, you know, some of the ability for Europe to bring some of what's happening on the European table to Washington, explaining it at a political level, it really requires that engagement between the President of the United States and the President of the Commission.
I'm going to go for questions because we are a little over time. Is there anybody who wants to ask you? Oh, very good, very good. Lieutenant General, everyone to stand to attention, please.
At ease, thank you. Two easy questions. We see what's happening in Ukraine. We see that Ukrainians have been able to maintain basically the state and run it during the war. Isn't it time that in the European Union we also start regulating how we're going to operate in crisis and war, start creating those crisis response measures, and what would be the role of the EU if this war is waged by NATO or by coalition of the willing and so on? Very hot topic, but I think maybe another red line that we should cross and stop talking about. And the second question is, let me think. Okay, isn't it also a time to start, I asked it yesterday already, that the EU is using great lobbyists in Washington, D.C. to promote and foster and explain what's happening and what are the interests in Europe, why we're doing certain things they're doing. Potentially, I would think also about engaging the social media more so that average Americans know more about European Union and so on. Because I think, from my experience, this is the best way. It costs money. Sometimes there are some political issues. Okay, why am I using the lobbyist? But a lot of countries are doing it. Thank you.
Well, I know it's not necessarily for DG Connect to make the decisions, and you can if you don't want to answer it, that's absolutely fine, Christian. But maybe the first question, because there is a cybersecurity question there to start.
And there's also a digital government question there, which is very important and which actually we also have to deal with in DG Connect and in my directorate. We're looking with very great interest, and we're talking a lot with the Ministry of Digital and the people of Europe in terms of how do you build a resilient government, because actually it's extremely interesting what they have used. They're using this DIA wallet technology in order to ensure that government continues, that they have payments, they build it. It's amazing what they have done. And this is something that we are very much trying to build also in Europe with having, you know, our digital wallet infrastructures. So I would say the seeds are there, we're building it, and we're engaging a lot with the Ukrainians around this. They're also participating in our pilots and so on, because we really want to use their experience. Overall, I mean, beyond the operations of government, I mean, you will have seen in the Ninista report, I mean, you know, you will have seen a lot of ideas coming there, replicated also and shaped in our preparedness union strategy. And when we're looking across the board, it's a very rich strategy, but one of the places where it's, you know, pushing us as institutions, but also the member states, is like we have to be able to think worst case scenario. We've not been good enough at that, right? We've been brought up in peacetime. I've never seen anything bad in my life. It shapes our minds. We have to be able to have these difficult conversations. And we have to be able to also look at, all the things I'm doing in cybersecurity. It cannot only be that I'm working against a peacetime scenario when I do these, right? I do risk assessments, for instance. We go around and look at our critical supply chains. Where do we have risk of disruption? Where do we have, where do we see pre-positioning? All of these things. We have to be able to work and think in a worst case scenario, what does that mean for our port security? What does it mean for our, capacity to move troops, etc.? These are all things that as civilians, and those of us who are working on the civilian side, we really need to start thinking about. And this is the work that we're rolling out now as well, very much also fueled by the preparedness strategy.
Well, thank you. And I'm going to go very quickly because we will run through the lobbying question in Washington. Should it be done? Should the EU be doing it?
Okay, one point. Okay,
very quickly, Tommy.
Only that. Let's put it this way. I think there it was a good point because there we have job to do. Just when I had a bit like to participate, discussion. My big surprise was how in White House, how ideological it is about European Union. That was really, I thought it was just, arguments and one-liners, but my impression is that at least this moment, there's a kind of this ideological resistance for European Union, and it's somehow reflected in our discussion. So I think to bring explain the European Union advantages cooperating with European Union, I think there's a long way to go. I hope that this will change now that there's some kind of rebalancing reality check in Washington, White House also, and when the economic numbers start to come in and maybe reactions and the midterms are approaching, but there's a very long way to go.
Thank you, Tommy. Cassie, you want to come in very quickly?
Super quick to your question or your point, General. I think the perception of the European Union or Europe is a bit flawed currently in other parts of the world. I'm not going to speak about lobbyists, but I do think there is a question that you should also be asking the private sector, which is, who are you and what do you believe in and what are you prepared to defend and protect? And I think it's very difficult for the private sector to remain the Switzerlands or the Irelands of this world. In other words, to be neutral right now. And I think what we've seen in the last couple of months is quite disappointing. Very few companies have actually stood up and been the custodians of the transatlantic relationship at a time of political turmoil. I think we need to expect that from companies. That's part of being responsible. And I think that is part of what you can do to try and convince the US administration that they need to maintain a close ally and partner with Europe right now.
Thanks, Casper. Final word to you, Lucinda.
Well, I haven't spoken for the Irish government in over 10 years, but I will say that Ireland is militarily neutral, but certainly not neutral when it comes to values and defence of our values. So that's all. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. I think we say thank you very much to our panel for today. And I'm going to now ask my colleague, Catherine Sendak, Katie, if you could close us out.
Sure. So thank you so much. What a wonderful panel. I'm Katie Sendak. I'm the director for the Transatlantic Defense and Security team at CEPA. This has been an amazing morning and an amazing couple of days here in Brussels. I hope we can continue engaging over here in this type of format. I've taken so many things away, but first and foremost, I want to say thank you. Thank you to everyone who's attended today. Thank you so much to our speakers and moderators. What wonderful conversations. And thank you so much to the ACE event team and all of our support staff. Fantastic job. And thank you so much to the CEPA team. We've been working really hard at this for months, and it's so happy to see this come to fruition. I just want to go over some quick takeaways and welcome suggestions. Please come up and tell me what you've taken away from the conference as well. I've said this to a few of you over the past couple of days. What we're noticing is that the conversation in DC and Europe is very different. And Europe is having trouble understanding the DC conversation, and DC is having a lot of trouble understanding the European conversation. So I hope today and yesterday have been a bridge to some of those conversations. We've been able to bring American voices, European voices, government, industry, and I hope we've taken away some of those commonalities. The two quotes I took was institutionalizing the role of disruptive technology, and I think that it doesn't just apply to security and defense, which is what I do, but the tech space in general. How do we make this more culturally accepted day in and day out and not one-offs? And then and I'm going to quote you, General, how do we take the lessons identified in Ukraine and actually make them lessons learned? And that's something that CEPA takes a hard look at as we look at the Ukraine space over the course of the conflict. But what I found most striking over the course of these conversations, talking about tech, which usually goes right over my head, is that at the base of it is really qualities of human nature. And we consistently discussed today and yesterday, how do we create a sense of urgency in peacetime? How do we make the human nature of, if we're in peacetime, we don't have to worry about it, so let's move on to the next issue. How do we maintain trust and grow trust? How do we have humility, to Lorenz's point? And how do we look at risk? And those are innately human qualities that we're trying to apply to a technological advancement place of where we are in this world. And I'll leave you with that. And I think that's a lot to consider. But I just want to thank you all. Thank you, Alina, for your leadership. And thank you all for attending. And if you're interested in anything that CEPA does and further analysis, please visit our website. And I know we have some stuff out there you can take with us. And hope to see you all very soon. Thank you so much.